I grew up in a rural, small town outside of Portland, Oregon. I didn't see or understand the complexity of poverty, homelessness, inequity, and racism. It just never applied to me, or to my friends for that matter. So once I married Ashish, we had many conversations about what life is like when you aren't white. I began to see the world through his eyes and the eyes of our friends who are minorities in this country. The stories are vastly different from each other, depending on family, history, education, and immigration status. I began to put together the pieces of the puzzle as my relationships with these friends grew and the conversations continued. There are many layers to injustice, and it was important for me to understand why I had certain privileges as a middle class white woman. That was the beginning of my journey, and if there's one thing I learned from that season, it was that I needed to cultivate a heart of humility and never stop learning. I never made any progress when I got defensive in a conversation, being because I was feeling offended or misunderstood. And the areas of injustice in Seattle alone are overwhelming. When I lived in South Lake Union for 2 years, I really got to know the neighborhood. And I think the best place to understand and start bringing about justice is in personal relationships in your own backyard. Lucky for me, Compass House on Dexter was in my neighborhood. I wanted to connect with people based on areas I knew we would have in common. Raising children, apartment living, being neighbors. For me, I started helping at Kindness Camp. I did that 3 summers in a row. But the connections with the kids were short and incremental. And we hardly knew their parents. For real community to happen, I knew there needed to be consistent connections built over time. So next, we started Cafe Club in September of 2019. We built stronger relationships with the Compass House staff and became friends with many of the residents. It was a strong and vibrant ministry. Because of those relationships, we had a better idea of how to be good neighbors when COVID hit last March. This gave us a true window into their school life. We already knew that a lot of them depended on getting fed breakfast and lunch at school every day. But what we didn't know was the large gap of access to online learning that spring. For me, I had a kindergartner at Montlake Elementary, which is only 2 miles away from Lowell and Tops Elementary, Tops K through 8, where most of his friends from Cafe Club went. Most of them did not have a device to log on to class meetings, much less the Wi-Fi required. If I was a parent in their shoes, I would be up at night wondering if my son would be ready for first grade in the fall. How is it possible that we could be so close in proximity, yet so far from the access required and the tools to help these kids stay on track with their education? The needs were simple: Wi-Fi access and education support in a pandemic world. So we started the 415 study hall so that kids could have a safe space to get these things. We had an overwhelming response from you guys, our congregation. Right now, we have about 20 students from ages 4 to adults receiving tutoring and learning support that comes in many forms. Really, it comes down to relationship though. And learning happens best within the context of love, security, and a bond of trust. Sometimes the tutors are playing Uno with their students, and sometimes they're preparing for an algebra test. Sometimes they're teaching a kindergartner how to read over Zoom, and other times it's laying out a rug in the large main space at 415 to let a younger sibling crawl on the floor. This is the work of the kingdom. This is how the community takes care of each other. This is justice. And it's happening Monday through Friday through people like you, Union Church. I come back to the words of Paul to the church. Paul was the guy who included everyone in the kingdom, Jews and Gentiles. He had a word to the church, to our calling as Christians. For me, the hardest part of 2020 has been seeing and giving into the finger pointing, the negativity and division that seems to be around every corner. Paul says this in Ephesians 4:31 through 5:2. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling, slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children, and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. I have felt so lost as to how to help this year and how to be an imitator of God in compassion, kindness, to love sacrificially like him while I'm stuck at home. But I realize that God is establishing his kingdom every day through small acts of kindness, love, and light that point people back to him. For me, justice doesn't have to be this big sweeping work that changes huge problems in public education. We were not created to handle a burden that big. But God does invite us to imitate him as his children in loving, one-on-one relationships, mentoring, being that auntie or uncle or that older sister, that other older brother, that mother or that father figure. This is the life that God invites us into.